Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first webinar from Wingman Cyber. The topic for today is GDPR, the European Union privacy regulation that has just about everybody flummoxed. And so we thought, what better way to bring some information to you than to bring you an expert. With us today is Lisa Barry Taymen. She has over 2 decades of experience assisting organizations with privacy, information protection, governance, and management. She's a certified privacy professional in the US, in Canada, and in Europe. She's a certified information privacy manager, a certified information privacy technologist. She's a fellow in privacy in the International Association of Privacy Professionals. I think you get the point. Lisa really knows her stuff about privacy. And she's going to walk us through the basics of what the GDPR is, if you have any customers that might be affected by it, and how you might be able to help them. I'll just do a quick notice that if you have any questions and you want to discuss this with either us or Lisa after the webinar, you're welcome to do so. Lisa's going to give you her contact information, and she's offering a special discount on consulting services if you mention Wingman for any of your customers. So without further ado, I give you Lisa and her GDPR discussion.
Thanks, Ellie, and a huge shout out to Ellie for putting this together. First of all, for seeing the need and then getting all of this going to bring this to you today. Interestingly enough, your clients, they rely on you to be their trusted advisor, to let them know about risks and things that are happening in the world. And the GDPR is it's just one of those risks, and a lot of companies don't know about it. I am amazed when I talk with people on a weekly basis how many organizations have just now learned about the GDPR. So what is this GDPR that I talk about? It is the European Union General Data Protection Regulation. And for us cool kids, we just call it the GDPR. So, feel free just to refer to the acronym from now on. The official purpose of this regulation is to harmonize data privacy laws across Europe to protect and empower all EU citizens' data privacy and to reshape the way organizations across the region approach data privacy. So let's talk a little bit more about the regulation itself. Prior to the regulation, they had something called the Data Protection Directive. It came out in 1995, and a directive in the EU is a goal. It wasn't mandatory. It was, hey, look, we think that this is a really good thing for your organizations to do, and it never really became a priority. I've actually talked to many organizations over in the EU who said, yes, we knew it was a good idea. We knew we should be working on it. It wasn't a part of our core business. It wasn't making us money. They had a kind of a we'll get to it mentality. And then in 2014, they adopted this GDPR, which is a regulation, which is a law, which means it is now mandatory for these organizations, both in the EU and in other jurisdictions, to protect personal data. My personal opinion is that it kind of went like this. We tried to do it the easy way with this goal, and you all didn't really get that. So now we're going to do it the hard way, which is a regulation. And again, like I said, it's a law. And so if you don't comply, you are violating the law. And there can be fines and things that go along with that violation. So before we jump into the GDPR itself, I want to talk a little bit about data transfer. We in the United States are considered to have inadequate data privacy protections. Surprised, right? All you have to do is think about Snowden, the NSA, the new Cloud Act from this past week, and you can kind of see where the folks in the EU are coming from. They're not quite sure that they can trust us with their data, even in the private sector. So in order to get data legally transferred, personal data from the EU over to the United States, we have some additional hurdles that we have to go through. Now, there are many different ways to do this, but one of them used to be called Safe Harbor. Safe Harbor was a voluntary program. Companies agreed to follow certain privacy principles. Unfortunately, that program was killed off in 2015. And what happened after that was everybody was kind of in flux about how to legally transfer data. But the US and the EU and Switzerland came up with a new program called Privacy Shield. And why am I telling you all about this? Well, it's a quick way for you to look at your clients and be of value to them in figuring out whether or not the GDPR applies to them. If you go to their website and you look under their privacy notice and it mentions US Safe Harbor, you know two things about them right away. First of all, they do not know that Safe Harbor died, and therefore they are most likely illegally transferring personal data from the EU to the United States. And second, you know that they are most likely going to be subject to this GDPR. So they have two things that they need to do. One, they need to become part of the Privacy Shield self-certification program. And then two, they're going to need to comply with the GDPR. So that is a quick and easy check that you can do on clients if you want to proactively look at whether or not the GDPR may be applicable to them. One of the other things we keep hearing, and people keep asking me, are they going to give a grace period like we do in the United States for different regulations? The answer I'm hearing is no. They're saying, hey, look, we've been looking at this a long time. We had the directive back in 95. We actually put Safe Harbor, I'm sorry, not Safe Harbor, but GDPR into play, several years ago. We've given you a grace period until May 25th of 2018. So there's not going to be any further grace periods for that. So let's jump right into what the GDPR is really about here. Do you guys remember those plastic bracelets? I don't know how many years ago it was, but it would say like, what would Jesus do? What would Muhammad do? What would Zena do, right? Well, I'm going to, at some point, build some different bracelets, and it's going to have this WWDSW on it, which is, what would the data subject want? If you keep that in mind, when it comes to the GDPR, you're going to be ahead of most people. The data subject is who the information is about. And we don't usually think about that here in the United States. We kind of consider when we collect data, it belongs to us, and then our business can do whatever it wants with it, right? Well, not in the EU. The EU, the data subject, that data belongs to them, and they have rights around that data. And in the EU, the definition of personal data is really, really broad. Somebody's email address, their business email address, their business address, their business phone number, as well as those personal items can be considered personal data. And the definition of processing this personal data is really, really broad. So it could be collecting, recording, organizing, structuring, storing, adapting, altering, retrieving, consulting, using, disclosing, restricting, erasing, destroying. All of those things are covered under this regulation. So for example, if you have a client that is a multinational, or is working with another organization that is a multinational, and somehow they're in the United States, but they are viewing EU personal data, even if that data is stored on an EU server, they're still viewing it, so they're still processing it, so they're still transferring that data from the EU to the US, which means the GDPR in most of those instances will apply. All right. So the bulk of our conversation today is going to be around, does the GDPR apply to your clients' organizations? And there are some questions you can ask that are going to help with this determination. One of the first questions is, does your organization have any offices or employees in the EU? And here you see a very long listing of all of those EU countries, as well as the ones that are in parentheses, which are the EEA countries, or Switzerland, which has a different kind of agreement, but yet is part of this. So if your clients can answer yes, that they have offices or employees in any of these locations, they may be subject to the GDPR. So a good question for you to ask is, are your clients multinational organizations? I have been surprised about how many organizations that I thought were US based. However, they do have offices, sales offices in many of these countries, with employees in those countries. And therefore, because of that connection, they are going to be subject to the GDPR. The next question is a little more difficult. It's, does your client's organization offer goods or services, even for free, to EU residents and process their personal data in conjunction with that offering? So let's break that down a little bit. Goods and services, even for free. If your client, for example, is selling retail items on the internet and they allow shipping to foreign countries, they allow people from foreign countries to order, they allow payment in multiple currencies, perhaps they have the option for different languages on their website. All of those things go to show that they are offering goods or services to EU residents. And when they get that, when they allow them to order, they're getting personal information. They're getting, it could be their business email address. It could be their business phone number. It could be their personal phone number, or their personal address. And so they're processing. Remember, we talked about the broad definition of processing. They're doing something with that data in order to give them those goods or services. So there are a ton of organizations that fall into this. Software as a service is a very large grouping that falls into this. Many times they don't narrow down who their clients are. They have clients all over the world that are using their particular software to do whatever it is their software does. And, in order for them to use that software, they collect some personal information, they collect billing information, they collect all kinds of things. And therefore, that software as a service company, even if it is only here in the United States, it is now subject to the GDPR because of that offering. I'm trying to give you some more examples here. If your organization offers a newsletter or on your website, or if your client organization offers a newsletter on your website and it's free, but you're asking for their email address or many times their business email address in order for them to receive that, yes, it is a free service, but you are collecting their personal information in order to give them that offering of the newsletter. Therefore, again, it could be free. It could be something free that brings a client into the GDPR. So this is the one that a lot of organizations, a lot of US-based only organizations that have no employees and no establishments in the US are getting pulled into the GDPR based upon this particular scope. So this is an important one. The next one is does your organization or your client organization monitor people's behavior that takes place in the EU? And so think about it. If they have employees over there and they're monitoring their behavior, that is monitoring. The one that sticks in my mind that I think makes it a little bit more difficult is online behavior ad tracking. I mean, there's so many things that we do on our websites that track people, not only just showing us, how many people logged in or how the system's working, but it actually starts telling us information about people, what their interests are, where they're located, where all this information is going, how are they using it, are they going to different websites after looking at yours? The more and more information you get, the more and more likely you are to be able to identify that individual. And when you start being able to identify individuals, that data becomes more and more like personal data. And then that personal data is from an EU citizen, therefore the GDPR is going to be applicable. So you have to be careful with how much you're using your website to track folks. So if you are monitoring people in the EU, again, even if you're not in the EU, then the GDPR will apply to you. The last one, which is where a lot of my clients are falling into right now, is that they are service providers to organizations that are working with the EU personal data. So the question, do any of the above organizations provide your company with EU personal data as their service provider? Again, I gave you the example of software as a service. If you're using software as a service, that software as a service, because they're doing work for you, they may be subject to the GDPR in their own right and may have their own obligations as far as the GDPR goes. Cloud and computing is a big one. If your company is a cloud computing company and you have clients that are putting EU personal data into your systems, you are going to be subject to the GDPR. Box storage, shredding, payroll companies, email marketing firms. Anytime you kind of think about service providers, you think about, hey, look, am I putting EU data into that service provider, or is my client putting EU data into my systems? And if so, you're going to be subject to the GDPR as well. Many of my clients have discovered that they are service providers for such organizations because they are now receiving due diligence questionnaires that are asking them specifically, are you working towards complying with the GDPR? Are you going to be compliant by May 25th, which is the enforcement date for the GDPR? Asking them questions about their security standards, asking them questions, just about different requirements within the GDPR. And again, that's how most of my clients have found out about the GDPR, as well as even the ones that we've already started working on the GDPR compliance. They're now starting to receive more and more of these questionnaires from their clients. So the first part of this, again, is talking with your clients to see if this applies to them. And if you can answer these questions with them and ask them and kind of have a discussion with them, then you're going in the right path to helping them determine whether or not the GDPR applies to them. Don't be surprised if they have never heard of the GDPR. I have spoken with many companies who've never heard of this, even as of today. Some of them are very large multinational companies. A lot of people are now just learning about the GDPR. So don't be surprised at all if that happens. Some of the businesses that are falling into the GDPR, we talked about payroll, we talked a little bit about internet sales. The one that is surprising to folks is charities. I had an organization contact me to discuss a privacy notice, and I talked with them a little bit about the GDPR, and they discovered that even though they were, I'm trying to think if they were New Jersey or New York, but they had a number of donors from the EU. And therefore, they were on their website, they had a form you could fill out to donate money. So people were filling that information out. That's personal data, EU resident, and then they were sending the money on to the charity. So the charity in and of itself was going to be subject to the GDPR, even though it was only a US-based charity. Same thing with medical. Many times folks from the EU will come to the US for treatment. While they're in the US and they provide their personal data, that's not subject to the GDPR. However, when they return to the EU, many times they may be using telehealth, they may be using other tools to continue to communicate with their doctors. All of that information that's being sent from the EU back to the US, that personal data, that will be subject to the GDPR. Law firms, same kind of thing. If they have clients that are EU-based or have EU personal data and they're sending it to their law firms in order to handle legal matters, that law firm can actually be a service provider. Universities, we recruit a lot of folks from overseas. If an EU resident sends in their application to a university, they're over there in the EU, they send it to a US university, that's personal information being transferred. GDPR is going to apply and that university is going to have to follow the regulation. So there's lots of different groupings that are going to fall into this. When you're talking, I wouldn't limit who I'm talking with my clients because, again, there are multiple entities that are going to fall into this. Again, they can be US-based only organizations and still be subject to the GDPR. All right, whoops. Let's see, let's go back here. Okay, so what's required under the GDPR? I am not going to give you an entire lesson on the GDPR. We would be here much too long. I will tell you this, I started reviewing the GDPR more than a year ago, probably more like 2 years ago. I still learn something new every day about the GDPR, but what I want to do is to give you some really high-level information so you understand how intricate the GDPR is within an organization. Essentially, it is going to require an organization to build an entire privacy program and implement that program. Privacy is not something we really talk about too much in the United States. All of us want our privacy, but when it comes to businesses and how they're using our information, again, like I said earlier, most people just think that, it's business information. Once they collect it, it's business, but it's not. Again, the information belongs to the data subject. And so the privacy program goes into many different areas. We've already talked about personal data transfer. That's a part of it, being able to legally transfer it from the EU to the US. There's some other areas like purpose of processing. Why do you have this information? What are you going to do with it? Those are things that people have to understand. The organizations have to understand, and not only they have to understand it, they have to tell the data subjects, this is why we're collecting your information and this is what we're going to specifically do with it. And if an organization changes its mind and says, okay, we're going to do something different with it, they may have to go back to the data subject and get their consent for that new purpose. So again, there's just a ton of things around privacy that in the US, we just don't talk about too much. And as you see on this listing, there are a lot of different areas that have to be covered. I talked about data processing, the purpose of processing. You may have to, if you change the way you're processing certain data, or you use new technology, or you're changing a service that you're offering to folks, you may have to do something called a privacy impact assessment to see if that's what you're doing, your changes are going to impact somebody's personal data. Training, general privacy and security training, very specific training on the GDPR in different areas of an organization. Data breach, we talk a lot about data breach here in the United States. We all kind of know what it is. In the United States, every state has a different notification statute. And in the GDPR, it has some specific language around data breach. And a data breach that has some risk to data subjects, in 72 hours, you have to notify a supervisory authority. So people are going to have plans in place to handle all these different areas. I've already mentioned third-party management, which is those vendor questionnaires and documents that people are having to fill out. A large part of it will also be record keeping. All of these items that you have up here and all of the processing that you're doing, you're going to have records around. One of the things that I heard in a webinar with one of the regulators is they kept saying, show how you are complying with these privacy principles. Well, as an organization, how do you do that? Well, you do that through documentation. So not only are you going to have to document each of these areas with policies and procedures, and again, you're going to have to implement, or your clients are going to have to implement this into their organization. So there are a lot of things to do. And I mentioned that May 25th of this year is the enforcement date. So there are a lot of folks who do know about it who are panicking, and I'm sure if you tell clients about this and they are subject to it, they are going to panic. My advice to those folks is don't fret, just get busy. There's still time to begin. Many of the companies that I work with will have bits and pieces of some of these areas like security and privacy training. They may have incident response, but maybe they don't have a data breach. So they've got pieces and parts of a lot of these things. Figure out what those are, and then figure out what you need to do to move forward. My personal opinion on regulators is this. They're looking for folks to do the right thing. They're looking for folks to try. We all know in the world of compliance that compliance is never ending. If you are ever, in fact, compliant with some regulation, you are probably in compliance for about 5 minutes before something changes in the organization, and therefore you are out of compliance. Compliance is a living, breathing, ongoing thing. And the regulators, I believe, understand that. And so it's one of those situations that doing something is so much better than doing nothing. So, once you talk to your clients about this, they find out that they are subject to this. It's one of those, just get busy, start working now, start doing what you can. And I truly believe the regulators will take that into consideration if something does happen. All right. Data subject rights, again, we don't think about that here in the United States, but they have a number of rights. You have to tell them how and why and where you've collected their information. They can contact a client organization and say, hey, look, what information do you have about me? I'd like to see a copy of it. They can say, hey, look, you've got the wrong information about me. I want you to correct it. They can say, hey, look, I want you to provide me with a machine readable copy of all of my information. The big one and the one that most people are talking about is this right to be forgotten. In some situations, not all, but some situations, a data subject could contact one of your clients and say, I no longer want to be in your systems. Perhaps they gave consent to the organization to have their information, and now they've decided they don't want that organization to have that information anymore. So they can contact them and say, hey, look, I want all of my information. So that's not just their name, it's their name, it could be their address, it could be their email address, it could be their phone number. So organizations are going to have the ability to find that information, but not only find it, but to delete it. So that's a large area that folks are concerned about because many of our systems, our computer systems, just aren't built for search and deletion. So again, data subjects have a lot of rights when it comes to the GDPR. All right. So what are the risks? Your clients are going to ask this. Why should I do this? Well, there are fines involved. If you type in GDPR and fines, you will find so many articles your head will spin. I recently actually saw an infographic that went through every significant breach in the United States and showed how much those US companies could have been fined under the GDPR. So there's all kinds of information out there about it. I'll just give you the little brief thing that on the fines, up to 20 million euros, which is more than $20 million, or 4% of the total worldwide annual turnover of the preceding financial year, whichever is higher. So most organizations, if they're single organizations, are probably going to be subject up to the 20 million. If you are an organization that is a parent company, or you're a sister company with other sister companies and a parent company, it is going to be the financial turnover for all of those organizations for the preceding year. So that can be a significant amount of money. Again, it's up to 4%, and they're not required to fine you. So I don't yet worry too much about fines. I believe that the regulators, first of all, are going to go after one of the big violators of privacy that we see on the news all of the time. The regulators themselves are still getting ready. A lot of people in Europe take significant breaks during the summer. So I don't think that they're going to go after anyone, just a normal sized US based company, on May 25th or May 26th. So I'm not really worried about that too much. I do think that they will probably in the top 10 go after a large US-based business, just to show that they can do so. I get a lot of questions about that. Is how are they going to establish jurisdiction over a US-based organization that has no employees or establishments in the EU? There are lots of ways they can do that. One of them being when a company signs up for Privacy Shield, they are saying, look, we are under the enforcement of the FTC. FTC and the EU work together on things. Number of international treaties. There are, well, I'll just put it this way. You look at your business and you say, okay, is my business more important to the US than doing all of the business over in the EU? So if you weigh that, if your business is that important, it's probably not. We as the United States want to continue to do business in the EU, and therefore you're probably will somehow be found subject to that. As well as if you just take the example that the US was able to reach Swiss banks. If the US can reach Swiss banks, the EU can reach a US-based company. So that's how they're going to get jurisdiction in order to go after these fines. I mentioned earlier one of the issues that I'm seeing for my clients, the big issue is their service providers. They're being asked by companies and they're being told, hey, look, if you don't have, if you're not ready, then we can't use you. The last one would be class action lawsuits. In the United States, they fail mainly because they can't show actual injury, but that standard is different in the EU, and so some member states will allow victims of data breach to sue, and they don't have the same injury and fact standard that we have in the United States, so those lawsuits may end up going through. I can say this, that victims of data breach are usually not as understanding as regulators about what you are trying to do with complying with different regulations. Let's see. All right, so now we're to the all-important questions section. As Ellie said, if you have a question, if you will type it in, I'll be happy to answer for as long as we have available.
And I'd also like to mention to everybody a couple of things that maybe we didn't discuss. This has been a rough week in US-based privacy issues, and I think we all know that something like this is coming, and it's just good practice to start talking about it with your customers, getting it ready for what's next. That's number one. Number two, the Access Private Shore policy covers GDPR compliance regulatory issues. That being said, we're not putting out 20 million euro limits, so compliance is still a priority and should be a priority for your customers. I'd also like to reiterate one more time that if any of this struck a chord with you, for any of your customers, reach out to me, reach out to Lisa. We're going to be sending you a handout that you can download on your screen, but we'll also email it to you. That'll help you diagnose if any of your customers might have issues, and if they do, we'll be going. So with that, if there are any questions, please type them in now, and we'll get Lisa answering anything you've got. Not seeing anything coming in. So
that's okay. I did a lot of information on you all. And you know, I probably just scraped the iceberg on the top of the GDPR. One thing I do want to go over again and just talk about is, again, you guys are trusted advisors to your clients. So what can you do to help your clients? Number one, just flat out ask them, are you subject to the GDPR or the EU General Data Protection Regulation? Many of them are going to look at you like you're speaking a completely foreign language, that they've never heard of this, and they are going to tell you, hey, look, we're just here in the US. We're not in the EU. We don't have offices or locations in the EU. So that's going to be an important time for you to go to this infographic that we're going to send you. Essentially, it's all of those questions that I talked with you about earlier in a nice infographic, and you can just have them answer the question. You can even send them a copy. We're giving it to them in PDF, right, Ellie?
Yes, you can download it now, or we're also going to be emailing it to you.
Okay, so you can actually provide your client a copy of that and have them go and think about it, about whether or not they're subject to this. And then if it appears they are subject to it, or they just need to talk with somebody about it, or they just have questions about the GDPR in general, just have them call me. These, other than my children, these are my favorite subjects. And so if somebody calls me, I will tell them what I know, or I will point them to the right information to assist them in determining, again, the first step is determining whether or not they're subject to it. And if they are, then figuring out what they need to do next. One of the things that Ellie mentioned is I built an online privacy GDPR readiness assessment. And if that's something that your client wants to do to figure out kind of where they stand with all the areas of the GDPR, happy to provide them preferred pricing if they reference Wingman Insurance. As I truly appreciate Ellie putting this together, and Wingman Insurance for sponsoring it and getting you all on the line. Does anybody have any questions about any of that information?
If you do, you can email us and we'll get you guys in touch. info@wingmanins.com.
Okay.
Thank everybody, in particular Lisa, for her time today in imparting her knowledge on all of us. And again, should you have any questions, reach out, and we're happy to work with each and every one of you, and Lisa will be too. So thank you all for joining us today, and we'll catch you next time with more interesting cyber topics.
Thank you.